They said he was her enemy. They said he would break her. But the first time she looked into his eyes, she saw a man who could keep her safe, even from himself. The wind that swept across the frontier carried the sharp bite of winter, rattling the loose shutters of the small wooden chapel. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine and candle wax, though the candles themselves had burned low, their flames flickering with every draught that slipped beneath the door. Mai stood at the far end of the aisle, her hands trembling inside worn gloves. She was 19, with a quiet grace that hardship had only deepened. Her dark hair was pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, though a few loose strands clung stubbornly to her cheek. She was dressed in a traditional silk cheongsam, the vibrant red a stark contrast to the muted tones of the chapel. A red scarf was wrapped around her neck, a splash of color against the encroaching winter gloom. Outside these walls, her life had been decided without her voice. She was here because her father had signed away her hand in marriage to a man she had never met, a gunslinger the town whispered about in fear, Corbin. To most, his name was a warning. A ruthless man who had made his name in the border territories. They said he had no mercy, that his heart was as cold as the steel of his gun. And now, he was to be her husband. Mai's gaze lingered on the chapel doors, her pulse loud in her ears. She could still run. The thought came like a whisper in the back of her mind. She could vanish into the snow, find work in another town, disappear into anonymity. But she thought of her younger brother, sick in bed and dependent on the care her father could no longer afford. If she refused this marriage, there would be no medicine, no roof over his head. The doors opened with a low creak, and the man himself stepped inside. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered, his dark coat dusted with snow. His hair was as black as midnight, framing a face that bore the marks of both battle and discipline. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes the color of storm clouds. Those eyes met hers across the chapel, steady and unreadable. He did not smile. He did not bow. He simply stood there as if measuring her soul. Mai's breath caught. This was the man she had been taught to fear. And yet, in the space of that single moment, something shifted. Because she saw no cruelty in his gaze, only a quiet, unspoken promise. The ceremony was brief. A pastor with a weary voice read the vows, and Mai repeated the words as though each one weighed more than the last. Corbin's voice was steady when he spoke, a deep timbre that carried without effort but gave nothing away. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Corbin did not kiss her. He only inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging a new duty. Mai kept her eyes lowered, clutching a small, wilting bouquet. She had the strange feeling of being both present and far away, a spectator to her own life. Outside, the snow fell in slow, drifting flakes, clinging to her cloak as Corbin led her toward a waiting carriage. His gloved hand rested lightly at her back, not pushing, not pulling, just there. She felt its warmth even through the thick fabric. The ride was silent. The sound of the horses' hooves was the only rhythm between them. Mai kept her gaze on the window, watching the blurred shapes of pines pass by. Finally, he spoke. "You're not here by choice," he said, his voice even. It wasn't a question. Her fingers tightened around her gloves. "No," she admitted softly. A long pause followed, and she dared to glance at him. He was looking straight ahead, his jaw tight. "I didn't ask for this arrangement either," he said. But it's done something sharp twisted in her chest. Not quite relief, not quite hurt. She turned back to the window. "Then we are both prisoners," she murmured. He didn't respond. When they arrived at his home, a sprawling but weathered estate set against the edge of the wilderness, she stepped down from the carriage and felt the weight of the place settle over her. The main house was built of dark timber, its roof heavy with snow, the windows glowing faintly from lantern light inside. A housekeeper greeted them and showed her to a room upstairs. Not their room, her room. It was small but warm, with a bed neatly made and a single trunk at its foot. On the table sat a basin and a pitcher of hot water, steam curling into the air. Corbin stood in the doorway. "You'll be comfortable here," he said. "You can come and go as you please." My only rule is that you don't leave the grounds without telling me. Her brow furrowed. I wasn't planning on wandering into the forest, she replied. One corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Good. Supper is at 7 inch, and with that, he left. At supper, the dining room felt cavernous. A long oak table stretched between them, the distance making conversation awkward. Mai kept her eyes on her plate, eating little. Corbin watched her for a moment. You don't have to be afraid of me. She lifted her gaze slowly. Should I not believe what everyone says about you? She stopped herself, pressing her lips together. They say I'm a killer, he finished for her, his tone flat. They're not wrong. I've done what was necessary to keep myself alive, but I don't harm those under my protection. His words held no warmth, but they were not cruel. Still, Mai's guard remained high. You don't have to protect me, she said quietly. Just keep your distance. That was her rejection, not a loud, defiant one, but a quiet wall built between them. A message that whatever arrangement their families had made, her heart was not part of the bargain. Corbin didn't flinch. If that's what you want. In the days that followed, she kept to herself. She walked the snowy paths alone, read by the window, and avoided lingering in the same room with him. When they crossed paths in the hall, he would nod politely and pass without comment. But she noticed things, even when she tried not to. How he removed his boots quietly when coming in late so as not to wake her. How he spoke to the staff with a calm respect she hadn't expected. How one morning she found a bundle of dried lavender left on her windowsill. No note, just the soft scent filling her room. Still, her resolve held. She reminded herself that kindness didn't erase the fact that he was the enemy. And yet, one evening, as she returned from a walk, she saw him in the courtyard with a stable boy. The boy had dropped a heavy bucket, spilling water over his boots. Mai tensed, expecting a sharp reprimand. Instead, Corbin crouched, helped the boy lift the bucket, and spoke to him in a low, patient voice before sending him inside to warm his hands. Mai stood unseen in the shadows of the porch, unsettled by the quiet truth settling in her chest. He was not the man she had been told he was, and that made keeping her distance far more dangerous than she had imagined. The days slipped into weeks. Winter tightened its grip on the land. Snow piled high along the fence lines, and the river that cut through the property froze in wide, white silence. Mai spent much of her time indoors, keeping to the library or her room, but she could not help noticing how the rhythms of life in the house began to pull her in. The housekeeper, Mrs. Renshaw, was quick to speak her mind, and quicker still to hand Mai a cup of tea whenever she passed the kitchen. The stable hands offered polite nods when she crossed the yard. Even the old hound by the fireplace would lift his head when she came near, his tail thumping softly on the floor. And Corbin was always present in the edges of her awareness. He rose early, often before dawn, and was gone until late morning, inspecting the grounds or working in the stables. He was a man of few words, yet in those rare moments they crossed paths, his eyes would meet hers with a steady, unreadable calm. One morning, Mai found herself standing at the edge of the frozen river, wrapped in her cloak. The air stung her cheeks, but the quiet was peaceful. She had almost convinced herself she was alone when his voice came from behind her. You shouldn't stand that close to the edge. She turned to find him a few paces away, gloved hands resting behind his back. I'm not a child, she replied. No, he said evenly. But the ice is thinner than it looks. Something in his tone made her step back. He didn't order her. He simply stated the truth, and she realized it wasn't control, it was concern. Small exchanges like that became more frequent. A shared moment in the library when she reached for a book only to find his hand there first. A quiet meal where their conversation lingered on the weather, the horses, the late delivery of supplies from town. Nothing personal, but not empty either. One afternoon, a snowstorm rolled in unexpectedly. The wind howled through the valley, rattling shutters and bending the trees. Mai was in the parlor when a loud crash echoed from the yard. She hurried to the window just in time to see Corbin struggling to secure the barn doors against the gale. Without thinking, she threw on her cloak and ran out into the storm. "What are you doing out here?" he called over the wind as she grabbed the edge of the door. "Helping," she shouted back. Together, they forced the heavy doors shut, the snow biting at their skin. When it was done, they stood there for a moment, breathing hard, their faces flushed from the cold. His gaze caught hers, and for the first time, she thought she saw something warm flicker in those storm-gray eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly, almost as if it surprised him. After that day, the distance between them began to shrink. Not deliberately, but in small, unnoticed ways. She started joining him in the stables, claiming she wanted fresh air, though she found herself listening more than speaking as he explained the care of the horses. He was patient, his large hands gentle when working with the skittish mare that no one else could approach. One morning, she dared to ask about the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. He was silent for a long moment before answering, his voice low. "I was 19, a boy with more courage than sense." He left it at that, but something in the way he looked at her afterward felt like a bridge laid across a chasm. And yet, her heart still wrestled with itself. At night, she would think of the stories she had been told about him, and wonder if she was letting herself be deceived. But each day offered evidence that those stories were incomplete. One such moment came unexpectedly. She was in the kitchen when Mrs. Renshaw's youngest daughter burst in crying over a broken doll. Mai knelt to comfort her, but the child wouldn't be soothed until Corbin himself appeared in the doorway. Without a word, he took the doll, examined the splintered arm, and promised to fix it. The little girl's tears stopped instantly. Later that evening, Mai saw him at the workbench in the study, carefully mending the doll with the same focus he gave to repairing a saddle. When the doll was restored, he left it outside the child's room without fanfare. It was such a small thing, and yet it shifted something deep inside her. A week later, she fell ill with a fever. The memory was hazy, waking to find a cool cloth on her forehead, hearing his voice low and steady as he urged her to drink. He stayed by her side for 2 nights, bringing broth, stoking the fire, and reading aloud from a worn book when she couldn't sleep. When the fever broke, she opened her eyes to find him dozing in the chair beside her bed, his head bowed. It was the first time she truly allowed herself to look at him without the filter of fear or pride. And what she saw was not the enemy. It was a man carrying a weight as heavy as her own, one who had chosen in ways small and quiet to share that burden with her. The thaw came slowly, as winter always did on the frontier. The days lengthened, snow melted into muddy ruts along the road, and the frozen river began to groan and crack with the push of spring water beneath. Mai found herself walking the grounds more often, sometimes with Corbin beside her. They didn't speak of feelings, but their silences had softened, no longer awkward, but comfortable, like the quiet hum of a fire in the hearth. It was on one of these mild afternoons that trouble came to their door. The sound of horses approached fast from the east trail. Mai was standing on the porch when 3 riders appeared. Men in worn coats, their faces hard, rifles slung across their backs. The leader, a gaunt man with a scar across his cheek, dismounted and strode up the steps. "Corbin," he barked. "We need a word." Corbin stepped outside, his presence filling the space between them. "You've had enough words, Briggs. State your business and be gone." Briggs's gaze flicked to Mai and his mouth curled into a sneer. "Heard you took a wife." A foreign one at that. Her blood chilled. She didn't know this man, but the way he looked at her made her want to retreat inside. Corbin moved subtly, placing himself in her line of sight to block Briggs's view. "Leave her out of this." Briggs laughed. "Oh, I will, just as soon as you hand over what you owe her." Mai realized then that this wasn't a friendly call. These men were here for something dangerous. She wanted to speak, to ask what was happening, but Corbin's hand shifted behind his back, a silent signal for her to stay quiet. The exchange was short but tense. Corbin refused whatever demand they made, and the riders left with promises that they would return. When the sound of hooves faded, Mai stepped forward. "What did they want?" she asked. His eyes were darker than she'd ever seen them. "Protection money. Briggs runs a band of men who prey on isolated farms. I've dealt with them before." She swallowed hard. "And now they know I'm here." "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "Which means you'll do exactly as I say until they're gone." 2 nights later, they returned. It was near midnight when the sound of hoofbeats thundered in the yard. Mai woke to shouts and the crash of something breaking below. She rushed to the door only for Corbin to meet her halfway down the hall. His coat was thrown over his shoulders, a rifle in his hand. "Stay in your room," he ordered, his tone sharp in a way she'd never heard before. She opened her mouth to argue, but the urgency in his eyes stilled her. "Promise me," her throat tightened. "I promise." He turned and was gone. From her window, she could see the shadows moving across the yard, hear the sharp cracks of gunfire. Every instinct screamed at her to run down there, to help somehow, but her promise held her in place. She could only watch as Corbin moved with a precision that spoke of years in the field, his figure steady under the chaos. Then, a flash, a sound too loud to be anything but close. She saw him stagger, one knee hitting the ground. Without thinking, she was running. The cold night air bit at her skin as she burst through the door and into the yard. The men were retreating, their horses kicking up mud as they fled into the darkness. Corbin was on the ground, one hand pressed to his side. She dropped to her knees beside him. "You're bleeding." "It's nothing," he muttered, though the strain in his voice betrayed him. She tore at the hem of her nightdress, pressing the fabric against the wound. "Don't you dare tell me it's nothing." His eyes met hers, fierce even through the pain. "I told you to stay inside and let you die." Her voice broke. "You think I could just watch from a window while they—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "You're my husband, Corbin." The words hung between them, heavier than gunpowder. Something shifted in his gaze then, not surprise, not even relief, but something deeper, as though he had been waiting to hear her say it, even if he didn't realize it until now. They managed to get him inside. Mrs. Renshaw fetched bandages and hot water, and Mai refused to leave his side until the wound was cleaned and dressed. When the house finally fell quiet, she sat beside the bed, her hand resting over his. "You protected me," she whispered. His eyes opened, and in the dim lamplight, she saw no trace of the cold gunslinger from the stories. Only the man she'd come to know, the one who fixed broken dolls, who stayed at her bedside through a fever, who put himself between her and danger without hesitation. "I always will," he said simply. Her breath caught. "Why?" He held her gaze for a long moment. "Because somewhere along the way, you stopped being just my wife in name. You became my soul's keeping." The truth of it settled over her like a warmth that reached the deepest parts of her. In the days that followed, Briggs and his men didn't return. Word must have spread that Corbin's land wasn't worth the risk. He recovered slowly, and Mai found herself spending each morning with him, reading aloud or simply sitting in quiet companionship. It was during one of those mornings, as she poured tea, that he spoke again of that night. "You ran to me," he said, his tone thoughtful. "I couldn't do anything else," she replied. A faint smile touched his lips. "I think I knew then the walls you built between us weren't as strong as you thought." She looked down, feeling her cheeks warm. "Maybe I didn't want them to be." That night, as the last of the winter frost melted from the eaves, Mai lay awake, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing in the next room. She thought of the woman who had stood in the chapel months ago, ready to despise him. She thought of the man she had been told to fear, and the one who now held her heart without asking for it. Somewhere between those two, they had found each other. Spring arrived in earnest that year. The hills turned green, the river ran swift with meltwater, and the scent of pine and earth replaced the long, sharp smell of winter. Mai found herself rising earlier each morning, drawn to the porch where the sun climbed over the ridge and bathed the valley in gold. Corbin joined her sometimes, moving more steadily now that his wound had healed. The scar would remain, a pale reminder beneath his shirt, but it didn't seem to trouble him. In truth, it troubled her more, a constant echo of that night, and the thought of what she might have lost. She didn't speak of it often, but there were moments when she would glance at him across a room and feel an ache, sharp and sweet at the same time. One afternoon, as they worked in the garden together, she paused to wipe the dirt from her hands. "You never told me why you agreed to marry me," she said. Corbin straightened, resting his hands on the handle of the spade. "Your father and I had business years ago. He called in a favor. I was meant to refuse but you didn't, she said softly. His gaze held hers. I don't know why, at first. Maybe it was the way he spoke of you, not as property, but as someone who deserved safety. He paused, his voice lowering. And maybe I was tired of being alone. Her breath caught. He didn't dress it up in poetry, yet there was something deeply honest in his words. In town, people had begun to notice. When she accompanied Corbin to the general store, whispers followed them. Once, a woman she'd known since her arrival approached her. Is it true, the woman asked in a hushed tone, that you've softened him? Mai had cut her off with a quiet smile. It's true, he's not the man people think. She didn't elaborate. His kindness was not a performance for the world. It was theirs. One evening, Corbin invited her to ride with him beyond the property lines. They took the West Trail, climbing until the valley opened below them in a sweep of green and gold. At the crest, they dismounted and sat on a flat rock, the wind carrying the scent of wildflowers. I used to come here when things were complicated, he said, looking out over the land. It reminded me there was something worth protecting beyond the fighting. She studied his profile, the way the light caught the angles of his face. And now, she asked. Now, he said, turning to meet her eyes, what's worth protecting is sitting beside me. Her heart swelled, the words settling deep into the places that had once been filled with fear and mistrust. That night, she found herself unable to sleep. She stepped quietly into the hall and, on impulse, crossed to his door. A faint light glowed beneath it. When she knocked softly, his voice called, "Come in." He was seated at the desk, papers spread before him, but his attention shifted entirely when he saw her. "Can't sleep?" She shook her head. "I keep thinking about everything that's happened. How we started." He leaned back, watching her with that steady patience she had come to know. "And I was wrong about you," she said. "I thought you were the enemy, but you were the one person who never tried to hurt me. Even when I pushed you away." Corbin stood then, closing the space between them. "You had every reason to be cautious maybe," she whispered, "but I'm done keeping my distance." There was a long, quiet moment. Then, as if something unspoken had finally been answered, he lifted a hand to brush a loose strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was light, almost hesitant, the touch of a man who would never take what wasn't freely given. She reached up, covering his hand with hers. "You have my trust, Corbin." And my heart, for the first time since she had known him, his composure broke. A soft smile curved his lips, one that reached his eyes and lit them from within. "Then you have mine," he said. From that night on, the shape of their life changed. There were still chores, still quiet meals and long rides, but there was also laughter, the kind that slipped in unexpectedly and stayed. She learned he preferred strong coffee over tea, that he could play the fiddle, though he claimed he'd forgotten most tunes, and that he always slept with the window cracked open, even in winter. He learned she hummed to herself while baking, that she could draw a perfect map from memory, and that she had a stubborn streak to match his own. The house no longer felt like his alone, it felt like theirs. Months later, when summer had fully ripened the fields, a letter arrived from her father. It was full of pleasantries and family news. But near the end, he wrote, "I made the right choice for you, Mai. I see now that the man I chose is not the one the world whispers about. Take care of each other." She read it aloud to Corbin in the shade of the porch. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment before saying, "Your father was wrong about many things, but not about this." She smiled. "About us?" He nodded. "About us." The seasons turned again. When autumn came, the hills burned with gold and crimson, and the evenings grew crisp. One evening, they walked the same trail they had taken months earlier, this time hand in hand. At the crest, Corbin stopped, looking out over the valley. "I used to think my life would end in the field," he said, "that I'd leave nothing behind but a name in someone's ledger. But now I think I was meant to end up here, with you." Her chest tightened with emotion, and she squeezed his hand. "And I was meant to find the man everyone else was too blind to see." The sun dipped low, casting the land in warm, fading light. They stood there in silence, two people who had once been strangers, bound not by an arrangement anymore, but by choice. When they turned back toward home, Mai realized she no longer thought of it as his home. It was theirs. And no matter what lay ahead, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had not married the enemy. She had married the man who had made her his soul's keeping.